The moving truck pulled away from the curb as I stood on my new driveway, surveying what would finally be my permanent home. After 15 years of military service, 4 deployments, and countless temporary housing arrangements, this modest 3-bedroom house represented something I had dreamed about for years: stability. Oak Ridge Estates gleamed with perfect lawns, coordinated mailboxes, and a sense of orderliness that actually felt comforting after years of military precision. I had purchased the house sight unseen during my final deployment. My real estate agent had walked me through virtual tour, emphasizing the reinforced concrete pad beside the garage, a feature that had immediately caught my attention for reasons most civilians would not understand. The pad had been installed by the previous owner for their RV, but would serve my purposes perfectly. The spring air carried the scent of freshly cut grass as I unpacked boxes in the living room. Through the front window, I noticed an older gentleman slowing his pace as he walked his golden retriever. I stepped outside, introducing myself with an extended hand. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with genuine warmth. "Tom Davis. Been here 20 years. Military, huh? Could tell by your posture." I nodded, feeling a sense of recognition that often exists between veterans. "Just finished my final tour. Armor Division. Looking forward to civilian life." "Good neighborhood for it," Tom said, but his eyes darted briefly to the house directly across the street. "Mostly good folks here. Monthly HOA fees keep everything maintained. Just be careful with the rule book. Some folks are stricter about it than others." Over the next few days, other neighbors stopped by with small welcome gifts. The Wilsons from 2 doors down brought homemade bread. The retired couple at the corner brought a potted plant. Each interaction reinforced my decision to choose this community, though several made similar veiled comments about following the rules closely. The reason for these warnings became clear on my 4th evening. While enjoying a sunset walk around the neighborhood, I came upon a scene that struck a discordant note in the peaceful community. A sharp-voiced woman with perfectly styled blonde hair stood at the edge of an elderly man's property, gesturing wildly at his mailbox while he stared at the ground. "The bylaws clearly state desert sand or autumn beige are the only approved colors," she said, her voice carrying down the street. "This is clearly bronze. You have 72 hours to repaint it, or there will be a formal citation." Her eyes caught mine as I passed, narrowing slightly before she forced a tight smile. "New neighbor. I am Susan Keller, HOA president. Be sure to review your welcome packet thoroughly. I run a tight ship here at Oak Ridge." I nodded politely, continuing my walk, but something about her tone reminded me of certain officers who confused leadership with intimidation. That night, as I unpacked framed photographs in my study, I paused at my favorite, me standing proudly beside my unit's M60A3 tank. The military had been downsizing certain equipment, and through a complex process involving demilitarization, proper licensing, and no small amount of paperwork, I had legally acquired one of these magnificent machines. Currently stored at a specialized facility 20 miles away, the decommissioned tank represented years of service and technical expertise. The next morning, I found a blue folder wedged in my door with "Welcome to OAKRIDGE ESDATES" emblazoned across the top. Inside was the HOA rulebook with numerous sections highlighted in yellow, along with a handwritten note: "Please ensure prompt compliance with all community standards. Initial inspection scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Susan Keller, HOA president." I thumbed through the excessive highlighting, noting how many arbitrary rules filled the pages. The military had rules too, but they served clear purposes. These seemed designed primarily for control. Setting the folder aside, I continued unpacking, unaware that my new home had already been marked for special attention. The early morning sun illuminated my backyard as I carefully measured the perimeter for my planned garden bed. Having reviewed the HOA guidelines thoroughly, I knew the project fell well within regulations. Native plants only, no structures over 18 inches, and positioned within the approved landscaping zone. I had even filled out the required landscape modification form, receiving written approval via email the previous day. The sound of throat clearing pulled my attention from the measuring tape. Susan Keller stood at my property line, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses pushed atop her head. Her luxury white SUV was parked directly across the street, engine still running. "Good morning," I said, standing to full height. "Can I help you with something?" "I noticed you appear to be making unauthorized modifications," she stated, not bothering with pleasantries. "All landscaping changes require prior board approval." I retrieved my phone, pulling up the email. "I have approval right here. Submitted the forms 3 days ago and received confirmation yesterday." Susan's lips tightened as she scanned the email. "This only covers the garden bed itself. Your choice of border stones requires separate approval, and these measuring stakes constitute temporary structures which are not permitted to remain overnight." The stakes were simply to mark my measurements before planting. They would be removed within hours. I maintained my composure, drawing on years of military discipline when dealing with difficult superiors. "I understand. I will remove the stakes once measurements are complete, and I will submit additional paperwork for the stone border. Thank you for the clarification." She seemed almost disappointed by my calm response, making additional notes on her clipboard before walking briskly back to her idling vehicle. My training had taught me to choose battles wisely. This was not one worth fighting. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Lisa Wilson from down the street, holding a container of homemade cookies. Her expression seemed guarded as she glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "Saw Susan making her rounds this morning," she said quietly once inside. "Wanted to check if everything was okay." "Just some questions about my garden project," I replied, offering her coffee. Lisa's voice lowered further. "Listen, I should probably warn you. Susan tends to focus on certain homeowners, usually newcomers or anyone who questions the rules. My husband and I have lived here for 5 years and we have seen a pattern." Over coffee, Lisa shared stories that painted a troubling picture. The elderly man with the wrong mailbox color had questioned an arbitrary fee increase at a meeting last year. A single mother on the next street had been fined repeatedly for leaving toys in her backyard after her work schedule changed. Each story involved residents who had somehow crossed Susan, followed by concentrated enforcement efforts. "Most people either fall in line or move away," Lisa concluded. "She has 3 loyal board members who never question her decisions." The next morning, I discovered my first official warning notice tucked under my windshield wiper. "Violation: improper vehicle parking. All vehicles must be parked with tires fully on paved surfaces." My truck's rear tire was perhaps an inch over the concrete edge onto the grass, something that would have been impossible to notice without careful measurement. In the following days, additional notices appeared for increasingly trivial matters. Trash cans visible from the street 4 hours before collection time, hose not properly stored, unspecified landscaping inconsistencies. None of these violations appeared in the actual HOA documentation I had carefully reviewed. The psychological warfare escalated when I began noticing Susan's white SUV frequently parked across the street, her cell phone clearly raised as she photographed my property. My military training recognized these tactics: surveillance, intimidation, establishing dominance. This was supposed to be home, not another battlefield. The situation came to a head when I was working in my front yard one Saturday. Susan stood openly on the sidewalk, photographing me without permission. Years of tactical training made me acutely aware of surveillance. "Is there something specific you are documenting, Susan?" I asked calmly. "Community records," she replied without lowering her phone. "Your garden border stones are 3 shades darker than your application specified." As she walked away, I realized I was dealing with someone who viewed rules not as guidelines for community harmony, but as weapons to be selectively deployed. The realization settled with clarity. Susan Keller had selected her newest target, unaware that this particular resident understood strategic response to hostility better than most civilians could imagine. The notification on my phone chimed at 6:00 a.m., a reminder for my VA medical appointment scheduled for 11:00 a.m. The evaluation was crucial for my service-connected back injury, the result of a vehicle rollover during my second deployment. After 4 months on the waiting list, this appointment would determine my treatment plan and potential disability rating adjustment. I followed my morning routine precisely, military habits persisting in civilian life. Shower at 7:30 a.m. Breakfast at 8:00 a.m. Medication at 8:30 a.m. I laid out my clothes the night before: pressed khaki pants, button-down shirt, polished shoes. The appointment location was 45 minutes away, and I planned to leave by 10:00 a.m., allowing extra time for parking and paperwork. At 9:45 a.m., I gathered my medical documents and headed toward the front door. Through my living room window, I noticed a vehicle parallel to my driveway that had not been there earlier. Moving closer, I recognized the familiar white luxury SUV belonging to Susan Keller, positioned precisely to block my exit completely. Not partially obstructing my driveway, but deliberately angled to make it impossible for my truck to exit. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. I reached for my phone, calling Susan's number, which was listed in the HOA contact information. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried twice more with the same result. Through her front window, I could clearly see movement. She was home and consciously ignoring my calls. I sent a text message. "Susan, your vehicle is blocking my driveway. I have an important medical appointment. Please move your SUV immediately." The message showed as delivered but remained unread. The clock now read 9:52 a.m. With mounting concern, I walked across the street to Susan's house and rang the doorbell. After the third ring, the door opened just enough to reveal Susan's face. "Yes," she asked, feigning ignorance. "Your car is blocking my driveway completely," I stated calmly. "I have a VA medical appointment that I cannot miss. Could you please move your vehicle?" Susan's expression remained impassive. "The street is public property. I can park wherever I want." "Actually, blocking a residential driveway violates City Ordinance 23.4, I replied, having researched local regulations thoroughly upon moving in. "I have an important medical appointment related to a service injury." "I will move it when I am finished with my coffee," she said, beginning to close the door. "Perhaps next time you will think twice about non-compliant garden borders." The door closed before I could respond. I stood momentarily stunned at the deliberate malice. This was not random. This was targeted retaliation. Neighbors had begun to notice the situation. Tom Davis stood on his lawn watching with clear concern. Lisa Wilson had stepped onto her porch. I documented the blockage with multiple photos showing different angles, timestamps, and the clear view of Susan's house in the background. I called the non-emergency police line, but was informed that without an officer available, response time would be at least 2 hours for a parking violation. I contacted the VA clinic to explain my situation, but was told rescheduling would put me back in the queue likely 3 months minimum. By 10:30 a.m., it was clear I would miss my appointment. The knot of pain in my lower back seemed to intensify with the realization. Tom Davis approached cautiously. "Susan did this to the Robertsons last year," he said quietly, "right before their daughter's wedding. Jack had questioned her authority at a meeting the week before." "Has anyone reported her behavior to the HOA board?" I asked. Tom's laugh held no humor. "She handpicks the board members. 3 of the 5 are her close friends. The other 2 never attend enough meetings to match her." By early afternoon, several neighbors had witnessed the situation. Many expressed sympathy but avoided direct involvement. Susan's reputation for retribution was clearly established. At 2:17 p.m., long after my missed appointment time, I watched through my window as Susan casually walked to her SUV and drove away. The casual saunter in her step confirmed what I already knew. This had been entirely deliberate. That evening, Margaret Chen, an elderly resident from the end of the street, timidly approached my door. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I saw what happened today. Susan did the same to me last winter when I needed to get to my chemotherapy appointment. I questioned her about an unapproved holiday decoration charged the week before. She handed me a handwritten note with contact information for other residents who had experienced similar targeting. We are all too afraid to speak up individually. She chooses her targets carefully, usually people living alone or those she perceives as vulnerable." I thanked Margaret, adding her information to my growing documentation. My military career had taught me the importance of intelligence gathering before taking action. As I organized the evidence chronologically, a clear pattern of abuse emerged. When I finally went to bed that night, my back pain radiating down my leg, I made a decision. Susan Keller had fundamentally misunderstood who she had chosen to target. This was not simply about a missed medical appointment. This was about a systematic abuse of power that affected the entire community. The dining room table disappeared beneath layers of documents. HOA bylaws, county ordinances, property maps, and handwritten accounts from neighbors formed a comprehensive battlefield analysis. My military training took over as I approached this as I would any tactical situation. Identify the objective, assess resources, understand the terrain, and develop multiple courses of action. My laptop displayed property records for Oak Ridge Estates alongside local regulations. 3 legal notepads contained meticulous observations of Susan's activities, witness accounts, and documentation of her selective rule enforcement. The pattern was unmistakable. She weaponized regulations against anyone who questioned her authority. The video call window opened, revealing my old friend Captain James Harper, now practicing law specializing in property disputes. "Based on what you have shown me," James said, reviewing the digital evidence I had sent earlier, "this is textbook harassment and selective enforcement. HOAs have fiduciary duties to enforce rules uniformly and in good faith. Her actions violate both the spirit and likely the letter of your community governance." "What are my options?" I asked, making notes as he spoke. "Document everything. You are already doing that well. File formal complaints with the full board, not just through her. Request a formal hearing. And consider organizing other affected homeowners." James paused, studying the additional photos I had sent. This driveway incident crosses from HOA politics into potential criminal behavior, blocking access, especially when informed of medical necessity, could constitute harassment under state law. Our conversation continued for over an hour, outlining legal strategies and proper documentation procedures. When we concluded, I had a clear understanding of both my rights and the process for addressing governance abuses. However, I also recognized that formal proceedings would take months, during which Susan's harassment would likely escalate. I needed a more immediate strategic deterrent. Moving to my study, I opened a folder containing documentation of my most valued possession, a decommissioned M60A3 battle tank. The military had been selling surplus equipment through rigorous legal channels, and through my armor division connections and considerable paperwork, I had acquired this piece of military history legally. The tank had been properly demilitarized, weapon systems rendered permanently inoperable, special licensing obtained, and all regulatory requirements meticulously fulfilled. Currently stored at a specialized facility 20 miles away, the 15-ton vehicle was fully road legal as a historic military vehicle. I reviewed my ownership documentation, transportation permits, and local ordinances regarding military memorabilia and historical vehicles. More importantly, I studied the HOA regulations word by word. Susan had highlighted numerous restrictions about lawn ornaments, unapproved structures, and aesthetic considerations, but there was absolutely nothing prohibiting historic military vehicles on private property. The reinforced concrete pad beside my garage, originally designed for an RV, had been properly permitted and approved by the HOA years before, ironically during Susan's presidency. I called Veterans Historic Vehicle Association and scheduled transportation for my tank, confirming every legal requirement would be met during transit. The logistics company specialized in moving historic military equipment and understood the proper protocols. Working late into the night, I developed a three-phase strategy. Phase 1. Continue perfect compliance with actual HOA regulations while documenting Susan's harassment. Phase 2. Coordinate with affected neighbors to build coalition support. Phase 3. Introduce the strategic deterrent, my fully legal, historically significant, and properly maintained tank. I reviewed county noise ordinances, weight restrictions for residential streets, and parking regulations. Everything confirmed my assessment. No law or HOA rule prevented me from bringing the tank to my property. At 2:17 a.m., I finalized my operational timeline. Susan Keller had spent years building a power structure based on intimidation and selective enforcement. She clearly believed I would either submit to her authority or eventually move away. She had fundamentally miscalculated her opponent. In the military, we learned that overwhelming force is sometimes the most effective deterrent, preventing conflict rather than engaging in prolonged battles. The tank would arrive in exactly 1 week. The gray pre-dawn light found me standing in my driveway at precisely 5:30 a.m. Clipboard in hand, I performed a final review of transportation permits, local ordinances, and property documentation. The specialized transport vehicle was scheduled to arrive at 6:00 a.m., early enough to minimize traffic disruption, but late enough to comply with noise ordinances. I had notified local authorities of the transportation of a historic military vehicle as a courtesy, though no permits beyond those already secured were required. The concrete pad had been inspected and confirmed to handle the weight distribution properly. Every legal requirement had been meticulously addressed. At 5:59 a.m., The distinctive rumble of a heavy transport vehicle turned the corner onto our street. Military punctuality remained evident as the massive flatbed arrived exactly on schedule. The experienced transport team, many of them veterans themselves, worked with practiced efficiency as they prepared to offload their unusual cargo. The enormous flatbed carried what appeared incongruous against the backdrop of suburban homes, a meticulously maintained M60A3 tank. At 15 tons of American military engineering, its olive-drab exterior had been perfectly preserved, though all weapon systems had been properly decommissioned according to federal regulations. This was now legally classified as a historic military vehicle, no different in legal status than a restored World War II Jeep, only considerably larger and more impressive. The transport team began the careful process of positioning the tank. Hydraulic systems hummed as they aligned the ramps precisely with my reinforced concrete pad. The first rays of sunlight glinted off the tank's metal surface as it slowly moved down the ramps, treads making surprisingly little noise due to the rubber blocks fitted to each track. The distinctive sound of machinery had begun drawing curious neighbors from their homes. Children in pajamas watched wide-eyed as this piece of military history took its place in their neighborhood. Several veterans among the residents approached with clear appreciation for the historic vehicle. Tom Davis walked over, coffee mug in hand, breaking into a wide grin. Now that is something you do not see every day in Oak Ridge Estates. Historic military vehicle, I explained, fully legal and properly registered. Across the street, Susan Keller emerged from her front door, coffee mug in hand. Her expression progressed rapidly from confusion to shock to outrage. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on her immaculate driveway as she fumbled frantically for her phone. I had prepared information packets for interested neighbors, explaining the tank's historical significance, its legal status, and my personal connection to it through military service. Several residents gathered around as I distributed these materials, answering questions about its history and specifications. "Was this the type you operated during your service?" asked Lisa Wilson. "Yes, Armor Division," I confirmed. "This particular model served through several important operations. Now it is preserved as a piece of military history." While addressing my neighbor's curiosity, I remained acutely aware of Susan's frantic phone calls. Through years of military training, I had developed situational awareness that allowed me to monitor multiple activities simultaneously. Susan's conversation appeared increasingly agitated, as she presumably received confirmation that everything I had done was perfectly legal. Within an hour, 2 other HOA board members arrived, both looking deeply concerned. I approached them directly, extending copies of my information packet. "Good morning. I understand this is an unusual site in our community. I have compiled all relevant documentation confirming compliance with both legal requirements and HOA regulations." The board members accepted the packets with obvious reluctance. One began reading immediately while the other continued glancing between the tank and Susan, who was now gesturing emphatically from her driveway. "There is nothing in our regulations prohibiting historic vehicles," the first board member finally admitted, flipping through the HOA bylaws he had brought with him. "That is correct," I confirmed. "I reviewed all regulations thoroughly before arranging transportation. The vehicle is properly registered, insured, and the concrete pad was approved by the HOA board in 2018 for heavy recreational vehicles." Throughout the morning, local authorities arrived in response to Susan's calls. Each departed after confirming that no regulations were being violated. The tank rested legally on private property, properly secured on an approved concrete surface. By early afternoon, Susan remained on her front porch, watching helplessly as neighborhood children asked permission to take photos beside the historic vehicle. Her power to control this situation through regulatory manipulation had evaporated completely. With each official who confirmed the tank's legal status, her authority diminished visibly. That evening, as sunset painted the neighborhood in golden light, I stood beside my tank, acknowledging the reality of what it represented, not merely a piece of military history, but a powerful statement about standing firm against bullying tactics. The community center hummed with unprecedented attendance for the emergency HOA meeting. Every chair was filled, with additional residents standing along the walls. In my 15 years of military service, I had participated in numerous high-stakes briefings, but the tension in this civilian gathering rivaled any pre-mission atmosphere. Susan Keller stood at the podium, projecting enlarged photographs of my tank on the wall screen. Her carefully styled appearance contrasted with her agitated tone as she addressed the assembled homeowners. This military vehicle drastically alters the aesthetic character of our community, she declared, gesturing emphatically at the images. Property values will plummet. Prospective buyers will be deterred. This is exactly why our HOA exists, to protect our neighborhood standards from disruptive elements. I sat calmly in the third row, organized binder on my lap, embodying the military composure developed through years of high-pressure situations. My documentation was comprehensive: vehicle registration, historic vehicle classification certificates, property compliance verification, and weight distribution analysis proving no damage risk to community infrastructure. Board member Richard Thompson, a retired accountant who rarely spoke at meetings, cleared his throat. The agenda indicates time for community input. I believe our newest resident should have an opportunity to address these concerns. Susan's expression tightened momentarily before she nodded with obvious reluctance. Of course, 3 minutes as per meeting protocols. I approached the front with measured steps, placing my documentation on the table before turning to face my neighbors. The military teaches effective briefing techniques: clear, concise, evidence-based presentations. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the community," I began, maintaining a professional tone. "I understand that my historic military vehicle represents an unusual sight in our neighborhood. However, I have confirmed compliance with all relevant regulations." I displayed copies of the vehicle registration, historic vehicle classification, and property documentation. The M60A3 is fully demilitarized according to federal guidelines. It is legally classified as a historic military vehicle, no different in status than restored military jeeps or transport trucks that several other residents own. Methodically working through each point of Susan's presentation, I referenced specific HOA bylaws that contained no prohibition against historic vehicles. I outlined the concrete pad's prior approval for heavy recreational vehicles, including its engineered weight capacity certification. Furthermore, I continued, county transportation engineers have confirmed no risk to street infrastructure, as the vehicle remains stationary on private property. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly as I presented clear evidence contradicting each of Susan's assertions. Then came the turning point that transformed the meeting entirely. "While researching our community guidelines," I stated, "I documented numerous concerning patterns of selective enforcement and rule manipulation. The projection screen now displayed a series of photographs documenting Susan's own property violations, unapproved landscaping modifications, a fence height exceeding regulations, and evidence of commercial activities conducted from her home. Each violation included dates, specific bylaw references, and measurement documentation. These violations remain unaddressed despite being clearly prohibited by our HOA charter, I noted. This suggests selective enforcement rather than community standard protection. A murmur spread through the audience as I transitioned to the most damning evidence. The screen displayed time-stamped photographs of Susan's SUV blocking my driveway, copies of my text messages requesting she move her vehicle, and medical documentation regarding my missed VA appointment. This deliberate action prevented me from attending a critical medical evaluation for service-related injuries, I explained calmly. When confronted, Ms. Keller explicitly stated this was retaliatory for perceived rule violations. The community center fell completely silent as this information registered. Then, from the back of the room, elderly Margaret Chen raised her hand tremulously. "She did the same to me last winter," Margaret stated, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Blocked my driveway before my chemotherapy appointment after I questioned a holiday decoration fine." This single testimony broke the dam. Other residents began raising hands, then standing, sharing their own experiences of Susan's targeted enforcement and intimidation tactics. The Edwards family received daily violation notices after questioning an unapproved special assessment. The Rodriguezes found their mail mysteriously delayed after voting against Susan's proposed rule changes. Lisa Wilson stood, addressing the board directly. "We have all been afraid to speak up individually, but together we represent a clear pattern of abuse of authority." The three board members who typically supported Susan exchanged uncomfortable glances as years of suppressed grievances poured forth from the community. Susan's face transitioned from confident authority to visible panic as her carefully constructed power structure began crumbling beneath the weight of collective testimony. Richard Thompson finally stood, addressing the room with newfound resolve. "I move that we conduct an immediate vote regarding Mrs. Keller's position as HOA president, based on evidence of selective enforcement and abuse of authority." The spring sunshine streamed through my kitchen window as I prepared morning coffee. 3 weeks had passed since the watershed HOA meeting that transformed our community. The vote had been decisive. Susan Keller removed from her position by an overwhelming 43-2 margin, with only her closest allies dissenting. The interim board now included Richard Thompson as acting president, along with 4 other residents representing different sections of the neighborhood. When they had approached me about joining the leadership, I had politely declined. "I believe I can better serve by helping establish clear, consistent guidelines rather than enforcing them," I had explained, offering instead my military experience in creating standard operating procedures that eliminated ambiguity. The tank remained on its concrete pad, though its presence now carried different significance. What began as a strategic deterrent had evolved into something unexpected, a community point of pride. Neighborhood children had begun asking questions about military history, veterans shared stories, and an impromptu educational opportunity emerged. This transformation led to the establishment of monthly tank days, where I would provide historical context about military vehicles, while senior veterans from the neighborhood shared their own service experiences. For the neighborhood children, these sessions became favorite weekend activities, combining history lessons with the undeniable excitement of seeing a genuine tank up close. The revised HOA guidelines had been completed the previous week, clear, reasonable standards that served community harmony rather than control. Gone were the ambiguous clauses that allowed selective interpretation. The new document focused on genuine community needs rather than aesthetic micromanagement. As I carried my coffee onto the front porch, I noticed the realtor's sign being hammered into Susan's front lawn. 3 days earlier, moving boxes had appeared, and yesterday a moving company had loaded most of her furniture. Her power base dismantled. She had chosen retreat rather than adaptation. Tom Davis walked his golden retriever past my house, waving cheerfully. "Morning. Ready for tank day this weekend. My grandson is bringing 2 friends who want to learn about military history." Across the street, Lisa Wilson was chatting with Margaret Chen as they collaborated on a front garden project that spanned both their properties, something that would have been immediately cited under the previous regime. Throughout the neighborhood, small changes revealed a community exhaling collectively after years of tension. The revised rules still maintained neighborhood standards, but the enforcement approach had fundamentally changed. The first violation notice under the new board had included offers of assistance and community resources rather than threats and punitive language. That afternoon, I carefully polished the tank's exterior, preparing for the weekend activities. The metal surface reflected the surrounding trees and homes, this machine of war now serving as a catalyst for community connection. Several other veterans had begun participating in tank days, sharing their diverse military experiences with interested residents. Richard Thompson stopped by, clipboard in hand, but with a friendly demeanor entirely different from Susan's inspections. "Just checking if you need anything for Saturday's event," he said. "The board approved your request for folding chairs and tables from the community center." "Thank you," I replied. "The response has been bigger than expected." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when you first moved that tank in, I thought it was just about winning a power struggle with Susan, but it has become something more important for everyone." His observation was accurate. What began as a strategic response to bullying had evolved into community healing. The military teaches that overwhelming force is not always about winning battles, but sometimes about preventing them entirely. The tank had served its purpose not through conflict, but by creating circumstances where constructive change became possible. As evening approached, neighbors gathered informally on connecting driveways, sharing conversations across property lines that had previously served as boundaries. Fences that had once been raised for self-protection were now metaphorically lowered. Standing beside my tank as twilight settled over Oak Ridge Estates, I reflected on the lessons of this unexpected suburban campaign. True victory was not in defeating an opponent, but in creating a community where such battles became unnecessary. The tank remained parked in compliance with all regulations, transformed from a symbol of confrontation into a monument to something more important: the power of standing firm against bullying with determination, strategy, and the incontrovertible right to be treated with respect.